The chapter we are now reading, titled Perfection of the Body, describes the process by which the existing physical consciousness can be perfected through two stages. The first stage is the relative perfection which can be achieved without spiritual help. And the second stage is the greater perfection which needs the powers of the Spirit. And by these two, the chapter takes us through various stages of this transformation of the physical consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo layers these stages one upon the other, rather than describing from below an upward ascent. He goes through as if layers one upon another. On each layer, these are the things which can be achieved. And then building on that, the next layer, and these are the things which are now done, and so on, until at the end of this chapter, he speaks of further vistas. Broadly, the layers go like this. The present passage we are going to read is the training possible by purely sports and physical exercises. Subsequently, over that, the means by which the body can be prepared for something more, the capacities, further capacities which need to be trained, and he brings then the influence of the subtle physical, and then the life force, and then the mind and will. And this forms one layer of training. And upon that, a further possibility, a further extension, bringing in the intuitive and higher influences. And then still above that, the relationship that is set from the physical consciousness to the mental and through the mind to the spiritual. And still beyond that, the mind and the spirit entering into the physical consciousness and pushing out the limits of its, the range of its limits, and extending those or freeing from those limitations. And then still beyond further stages, until at the end he says, a complete bridging from the material, most material, to the highest spiritual. That being accomplished, a further possibility exists for the higher ranges of spirit to bring down into the body, for which he says the current human conception is incapable of handling those possibilities and those ideas. So he stops speaking more. He says there are further vistas, but it would be premature to speak of them, because the human mind as it is now constituted can only go up to here and cannot understand things beyond that. So he has actually come to a point where he has the experiences, he has himself developed those possibilities in his own consciousness, but the human mind to which he is addressing is incapable of understanding beyond that point. So he says that's all he will speak of. And this whole journey from where we are, and it doesn't matter where we are in our physical consciousness, from where we are up to this point, all that must be done is mapped out. In that sense, this is one of the most significant chapters as far as training of the physical consciousness is concerned. The next chapter moves on to a description of the divine body which has already been transformed, and what are the issues there in the transformation and so on. But this is what takes us from where we are to that possibility. Nevertheless, these are some of the last articles he wrote, and he had to limit himself. He could not sit and write in extreme elaboration. He had to limit himself to the time and the space of circumstances. And so he captures in vast sweeps things which he has elsewhere discussed. And that is why it is often easy to gloss over some of his statements in this chapter without taking the full import of what they contain. But if we pause, and as we will do, we will try to go deeper wherever possible, wherever we can access it. If we pause and explore, we find that everything is given to us to help us develop our physical consciousness, to raise it all the way to its spiritual potential. In the last part we read, it was a description of the body as a product of the inconscient. And we saw that within, at the heart of the inconscience, is the superconscious presence of the divine seated, using the inconscience as a mask. And he says that superconscious presence is there in the body, has made it, and its emergence in our consciousness is the secret aim of evolution. So even as we look upon the body's limitations, even as we sometimes put up with it, drag it along, it is useful to begin to look upon the body as the first, let's say, model one, created by this superconscious presence as its means of self-expression. And our task as mental beings having a body is to assist that process of emergence of the superconscious presence and participate in its transformation of this body to the next model that it is destined to be. For this purpose, now we go step by step. In the use of such activities as sports and physical exercises for the education of the individual in childhood and first youth, which should mean the bringing out of his actual and latent possibilities to their fullest development, the means and methods we must aim are limited by the nature of the body. The sentence is long, there are two other sections, but this first simply says that what means and methods we use through sports and physical exercises, these must be limited by the nature of the body. Every body has its svabhava. Just as in the domain of mental education, we have been taught by Sri Aurobindo that the mind must be consulted in its own growth, because according to one's svabhava, according to the natural turn of the mind, one has to lead the mind in its natural way. So it is also with the physical consciousness. There are certain natural types, constitutional types, hereditary types, racial types, backgrounds of training. Within each of these, there are the three modes of nature, the tamasic, rajasic, and sattvic types. And then there are those where the balance between the physical, vital, and mental is differently arranged within all these variations. So it makes for a huge range and in principle an infinite variety, even though one can broadly categorize them in different ways. And according to the body type, the means and methods will be limited. In the field of sports, for example, we recognize that there are certain body types which are better suited for weightlifting, for example. And here the whole focus is on the muscular development, muscular strength, and it's tied to the structure of the bones and the strength of the bones and so on. There are other body types which are better suited for speed and swiftness, runners, and they have a light frame, light bones. Even within the muscular structure, we find two types of muscles. Muscles which can twitch rapidly, but they're not so strong. And there are muscles which can move slowly, but they're stronger. And all of these, if you look at a person and study his body type, automatically set before you the natural path of training of the physical consciousness. So as long as we are using activities such as sports and physical exercises, this recognition is essential, and this becomes the natural starting point. The means, methods are limited by the nature of the body. But the aim of this process, the aim must be such relative human perfection as the such relative human perfection of the body's powers and capacities and those of the powers of mind, will, character, action, of which it is at once the residence and the instrument, so far as these methods can help to develop them. So with these methods, what we do is we look upon the body as the resident vehicle and the instrument for the body's powers, capacities, powers of mind, will, character, action. All of these are inhabiting this body. And for that, using these methods, we develop the relative human perfection, push the body's skills as far as they go. And what is that which is possible? The bringing out of his actual and latent possibilities to their fullest development. Whatever you have as your actual capacity and your latent capacity. Now, the actual capacity is that which is seen already. It's obvious. We can all run, lift, walk, have these skills, make harmonious movements, and so on. But there are latent possibilities which are not always visible. Sometimes one sees, particularly in certain hereditary lines or in certain civilizations, where a civilization had perfected certain possibilities, and then perhaps because of some oppression, some natural catastrophe, or some colonization, there was an enslavement and a suppression of those very capacities for generations, centuries. And yet, after that difficulty passes, suddenly the thing bursts out again. And these are signs that whatever is held in the body and developed as a possibility remains across generations even if it is covered up and not given an opportunity to develop. So there is something of the persistence of the physical consciousness which can carry these things for a long time. I'll just share one example of my own observation in a case when I was staying with a family that was involved with production of electronics components and small fine circuits. And I was wondering how they got into this space, because I saw nothing in the immediate family culture that would attract them to the electronics. They were businessmen. They had not even been through their education in the formal line of electronics. It was just a business enterprise. So I probed a little and I asked, where does your family come from? Unfortunately, in most families in India, the lineage is still known, but that's being lost also quickly. So I asked them where they come from. They gave me some location. I knew nothing about that. Then finally I said, what did your ancestors do? And they gave me some story about business. And I said, well, what about before that? And eventually, and this was the interesting part, eventually they said they were part of a lineage of carpenters. And their whole skill was making perfect designs with the hands. And it was this precision and perfection of the material form which was the skill in that lineage, which now came up through a more mentalized generation in the electronic sphere. But that sense of the continuity of that energy was, to me, very obvious. But I've seen these tendencies, even when they are as if suppressed, they rise up. So there is an actual possibility, and then there is a latent possibility. And it's not easy always to recognize what that latent possibility is. It needs either an intuitive insight or a perspective which goes back many generations. But whatever those things are, actual or latent, to develop them to their fullest. This is what we would do with the sports and physical exercises. In here, he has already prepared us for what is to come later. He has set up the relation between the body consciousness and the one who inhabits. And this includes powers of mind, will, character, action, etc., which are all resident in the body as well as using the body as an instrument. Then, briefly touching upon the previous chapter, he says, I have written sufficiently about the mental and moral parts of perfection to which these pursuits can contribute, and this I need not repeat here. The whole chapter before was about this development of the character and personality through physical training. Then he moves on. For the body itself, the perfection that can be developed by these means are those of its natural qualities and capacities, and secondly, the training of its general fitness as an instrument for all the activities which may be demanded from it by the mind and the will, by the life energy or by the dynamic perceptions, impulses, and instincts of our subtle physical being, which is an unrecognized but very important element and agent in our nature. So again, he is giving you two distinctions, two layers for the body's perfection. The first layer is the perfection of the natural qualities and capacities of the body itself. The second layer is the capacities of the things which inhabit the body. And then he has a list of things there. So let's see, just the body itself, its natural capacities would be, say, physical strength, physical swiftness, physical health, physical harmony, and so on. The body itself does not need to, say, play the piano or the violin or the sitar. It's not a natural capacity of the body. Rather, those are natural capacities of the mind working through the body. The music played is an expression of the mind. Similarly, for the body itself, part of the natural capacity is the process of eating food. But going to cook food, driving a car, or on the other extreme, climbing trees or climbing mountains, would not be activities of the body proper, but rather activities of the life force inhabiting the body, using the body as an instrument. So he's making a distinction here between these layers. The body itself has natural qualities and capacities. So we have discussed so far capacities. The body also has qualities, suppleness, the fluid movement, harmony, strength, resilience, etc. would be qualities going with that, which are different from capacities which are more action oriented. The secondly is, now this is the more interesting part, the training of its general fitness as an instrument for all the activities which may be demanded from it by these other layers. So now we are looking at the body. Here is this vehicle for everything else to work through on the material plane. Think of it this way. We are primarily mental beings in our evolution. But as mental beings, we would live in the mental world left to ourselves. To be able to act on the material world from the mental world is not possible. You need to have something connecting you into the material world. So even if you lived in a mental body, to act on the material world, you would have to materialize part or whole of the mental body to be able to act on matter. Instead of materializing, we have found a way through evolution to assist some part of this machinery of the biology that was evolving to refine itself sufficiently that the mind can hook into it. The nervous system and brain have been sufficiently refined. And then our mental body has as if joined into it. And at that point, we have forgotten that we are mental beings. We have become one with the physical and we say, oh, this is me. But in our internal subjective experience, the truth still remains. We know we are mental beings first, and the body is not really living up to what we feel ourselves to be or what we feel we can do and express. So the whole struggle in our life is as if to pull up the body's capacity to be able to express enough what we want to express as mental beings. But once we realize this distinction, the relationship in the struggle changes. So here is this first shift, that the body is the instrument for all these activities, and this is demanded on the body to act in certain ways by the mind and the will, both in the domain of mind, by the life energy or by the dynamic perceptions, and this comes in the domain of the vital. And then subtle physical being. So he is looking at subtle physical also as an inhabitant of the gross physical, which plays a critical part. But all these, mind, vital, physical, subtle physical, form the base of what we generally speak of as the subtle body. Primarily, the subtle body is more the mental body, but carries also something of the vital and something of the subtle physical. And this subtle body is the one who lives in the gross physical in identity. So we look upon the body as an instrument for this. And mind and will is one. Of all of these, he will elaborate later. Mind and will is one. The other is life energy and dynamic perceptions. This dynamic perception is a very suggestive word, and it covers a whole class of instincts of the life energy in the body, where in the midst of action, the life force senses a certain response and acts instinctively. For example, if when you are driving, suddenly there is a blur of a movement on the side, there is not enough time for the mind to act, to even observe what that blur is. It could be another vehicle coming in collision. It could be a movement of someone's hand next to you. It could be a tree shaking. It could be a reflection on the glass from something else. It could be any number of things. But at that moment, the life energy surges out. The rationality is pushed aside. It knows what it is. It knows in what way it is coming, whether it is dangerous or not. It kicks in and does something which is exactly right to avoid the danger. You turn, you brake, you do a whole combination of things without thinking. And it's almost an instinctive action. And it involved two things. First, a perception of what's happening. And in that perception, not only what is happening, but what needs to be done as right action, which involves many complex coordinated movements. And then an actual dynamic expression of what is seen. So this is the dynamic perception, a perception in action expressing itself even as it is seen, but in the domain of life energies. With just one word, he has brought in a whole range of phenomena, which also is part of the training on the physical consciousness and involves the perfection of the physical consciousness. So, life energy, demanded by life energy or demanded by the dynamic perceptions. And these are so important because they are things which happen in the domain of activity. I've given an example which is somewhat extreme because that's where you see how mind is separated completely, and intellect does not have the skill to deal with a complex situation like this. But a similar thing happens even without danger when, for example, an engineer or an architect is facing a difficult combination. How do I make this happen? There can be an intellectual perception of a solution, but there are also many who are not so intellectual. They feel with their energy, oh, this is the way, and the problem is solved. I've seen many who are interior decorators would need to be in the space, to feel out the space, connect with the vibration, and then it's as if things fall into place. Even there are two types. There are those who feel and know and express directly, and then there are those who feel and sense, and they still have to play with the physical processes. Try this out, try that out. But they know when it's right, they know when it's not right. But all that knowing is part of this dynamic perception in the life energies. And then, coming below that, impulses and instincts of our subtle physical being. So here is a gradation of which we are not normally conscious, and he brings that to our awareness. Our subtle physical being, which is an unrecognized but very important element and agent in our nature. Sri Aurobindo rarely uses the word very. When he does, you must understand that it is actually very, very, very important in our normal usage of very. So it is a very important element and agent of our nature. In this subtle physical being also are impulses and instincts, which are different from the gross physical being's impulses and instincts. It's often difficult to distinguish between its instincts, the subtle physical, and the life force. Because very often the two tend to get mixed at that level of working. So it's difficult to identify specific examples which would be so distinctly separate on that level. But one such could be the instinctive feeling we have as regards food. If we do not allow our greed to come in the way, we look at a certain food and we know instinctively whether it is right for us at that point or not. Or when we are sick, we have an instinct by which we crave certain types of food. And it's the craving itself is more a characteristic of the life energy. And yet this craving is felt in the physical itself. In the body, you feel the body aching for it. And if the mind participates and the mind does not overwhelm the physical instinct, then the mind can actually help the body find the right thing. Because when the body craves, I need something which is like this. And what I'm feeling like this is the vibrational quality. I can translate it in terms of sensory experience. I say, it'll be something liquid, it'll be something salty, it'll be something warm, but I can't yet translate it into what the thing is. And then the mind can help throw options until it clicks. Ah, that's the thing. I know it when I remember it or sense it, but from the feeling itself, I can't always get to the thing that it was, except if a memory pops up on its own. That sort of feeling, but which knows and which carries forward, would be in that domain which is bridging life force and the subtle physical. But the pure subtle physical action would be seen most when the physical body is taken to its physical limit. It does not have the calories necessary, it does not have the necessary physical strength, the muscles are not strong enough to do this, the bones would break under this pressure, the blood flow and the capillaries would get frozen by the cold, whatever it is. The physical limits are exceeded. And yet the body is able to carry through. And that's generally a sign that it is the subtle physical which has imposed its capacity onto the gross physical and is pushing it beyond. Very often we find people who go on trekking. Okay. Impose the capacity, we could use two words, impose or superimpose. There is a capacity which is far more fluid and flexible in the subtle physical. But it is of the same density as the gross physical. And in the workings of the gross physical, it is the base of the subtle physical which lays the lines along which the gross physical moves. When the gross physical cannot do something and there is a necessity for survival, then it's as if the free capacity of the subtle physical is brought forward, and for a moment at least, it projects itself in the domain of the gross physical and pushes its capacity, its skill or its resilience or its energy into the physical substance. So for that time, it's as if the physical body's capacity is transcended. Another example would be, say, when you do fire walking. If the tissue touches hot coal, it should be burnt. And this is a law of material tissue. But at that time when it is happening, somehow it doesn't burn. Because the subtle physical would not be burnt by that temperature at least. And for a moment, the subtle physical has pushed its capacity and overridden the limits of the gross physical. So it is as if superimposing. When you have to what? Okay. Yes. So the mind can interfere with this process. The life energies can interfere with this process. Or even the gross physical may refuse this support of the subtle physical. That also happens sometimes. That the body, either because of some past habit or some suggestion from outside, it has a fear or it does not permit this movement to take place. Sri Aurobindo has a very interesting way of looking at these things. He says, left to themselves, there is a natural perfection and harmony which has been developed in us, especially in these layers, which nature has evolved over billions of years. The problem is that natural rhythm and harmony is broken by the working of the mind and mental will and mental desire. And that's really what creates the chaos and breaks the natural rhythm. But when you see such things in nature, there you get some idea of how that natural rhythm would work, even in us. So if somehow the mind were to withdraw and allow the body to find its right feel, many of these things could be resolved easily. But this subtle physical, which is an unrecognized but very important element and agent in our nature. So I was giving that example of the limits, say when you have in extreme cold or heat, etc., where the normal tissue would be incapable of handling things, and yet the body somehow goes through. So the subtle physical has its own impulses and instincts, and it is those which tend to lead the body also, although working through the body normally. Another example which I may give of their relationship is when there is severe damage to the physical tissue. The entire healing process involves an intelligence which is provided by the subtle physical, which guides like a template the whole healing process and the form of the body that is recreated. If there was not this subtle physical still present, the gross physical would not know what form to develop the physical body. But while the gross physical was damaged, the subtle physical is not so easily damaged because it is fluid and plastic. So their relationship is very important for the proper working of the physical. So here he describes 3 layers: mind and will, life energy and dynamic perceptions, and impulses and instincts of subtle physical. All these 3 layers are inhabiting this physical, gross physical body and use it as an instrument for all their activities. Now, at this point, he has just brought us in relation from the physical to these 3. Next, he will describe how these 3 can infuse themselves or work upon the physical. So he goes on, next sentence. Health and strength are the first conditions for the natural perfection of the body. So anything, if the body had to be perfected for anything, the first base will be this health and strength. If the body is not healthy, no perfection is possible. If it does not have strength, capacities, intentions, objectives which the higher consciousness wants to express, it would be incapable of. And again, you would have an imperfect instrument. So the first condition is health and strength. Later conditions will follow, which would include the plasticity and consciousness, etc. But even for health and strength, he will show us so many levels involved in perfecting the health and strength. So health and strength, not only muscular strength and the solid strength of the limbs and physical stamina, but the finer, alert and plastic and adaptable force which our nervous and subtle physical parts can put into the activities of the frame. So here's again a new level within which finer gradations have been revealed. On the most material part, on the gross physical, the muscular strength must be there, the solid strength of the limbs and the physical stamina. So muscular strength, without which if you take it to the other extreme, the lower extreme, the body would not even be able to lift itself. You want to get up and stand, well, your muscles have to be strong enough to lift your own weight. If you want to act on the material world, your muscles should be strong enough to move things which you want to act upon. Upon that, the strength of the limbs, which is not just muscular strength, but also the movement, the joints, the bones, and all of these as expression through the action of the limb. And then upon that, physical stamina. Oh, I can lift, I can do this, but I can't do it longer than 5 or 10 minutes. The stamina allows you to continue through the day for as long as you want without limitation. You will recall many of these things which are now being discussed were already implied in the passage we read in the Synthesis of Yoga of physical perfection. And this kind of a physical resilience, the body's capacity to go without fatigue and so on, were all part of that. How to develop that is described in this chapter. So you will recall my saying that these chapters in the Supramental Manifestation are as if a continuation of the Synthesis of Yoga, focusing on the physical consciousness. So this is the lower part of the gross physical, muscular strength, strength of limbs, physical stamina. Upon that is the layering of the finer, alert, plastic and adaptable force which our nervous and subtle physical parts put into the activities of the frame. So here's a very interesting relationship. The physical body is like a frame upon which the subtle physical and nervous system sits. And they bring into the physical frame the finer, alert, plastic and adaptable force. The subtle physical has a force, a skill, a plasticity, which is not only more fine, refined and subtle, but also it is more alert. It is able to register to fine variations, fine movements. It is awake. It knows even when the physical is half asleep. And then it is much more plastic, and it is also more adaptable. So plasticity here is of a layer where the subtle physical can flow actually in shape in its plasticity, but adaptability is its capacity to adjust to changing circumstances, say range of temperature or range of energies required, intensity of energies, intensities of effort, etc. New rhythms, new patterns which the gross physical cannot adapt to. For example, change of food, change of humidity, change of sleep cycles. Now these are all things with which the gross physical has to struggle with. The subtle physical and the nervous layer can adjust to these things much more easily. Just as an example, the common experience we have had when we travel across time zones, what is called jet lag, is one where the gross physical body gets hungry at a fixed time, although the mind is not hungry. You can actually feel the mind not only doesn't want food, it's not hungry, but the stomach is paining. So sometimes I end up using this word, I'm not hungry, but my stomach is paining. And that's the distinction. Similarly with sleep, you actually feel sleepy because you're tired. But the gross physical layer is not sleepy. It is somehow experiencing this high level of energy which you associate with daily work. And there is this struggle with the mind which wants to sleep and the gross physical which cannot, or is, although it's asleep, it's tired, it's somehow not being able to pull down its energy levels purely because of habit. But behind the gross physical is the subtle physical which can adjust. It is responsive to the mind. And if we can consciously bridge the mind's intention to the subtle physical and the subtle physical to the gross physical, then we can shape the body's response and assist it to rapidly shift into the new mode, the new rhythm, or the new requirement and adjust easily. And these are the things which he will reveal to us as we go along. So, health and strength of the gross physical, but also health and strength of this finer, alert, plastic, and adaptable force, which our nervous and subtle physical parts can put into the activities of the frame. That is also a layer of health and strength. Now, when it comes to the subtle physical health and strength and the force that it can bring on the gross physical, there are things we can do there directly. Activities which assist the subtle physical to become more strong, more fine, alert, plastic, and adaptable, more healthy. Proper sleep, proper nutrition are like a base. We tend to think that it's the body, gross body, which needs proper sleep and proper food. But actually, much more than the gross body, it is the subtle and the mental in which connects to the subtle, the part of the mind which connects to the subtle, which need these. They say that the gross physical can go without food and sleep for a very long time. Without food, even for longer. Without sleep, after a while you go mad, they say. Now what happens actually, it's not the gross physical which goes mad, it's the mind. Not even the mind, it's the part of the mind bridging with the gross physical through the subtle physical, which tends to as if drift off and open out to the subtler worlds without distinction from the physical. You begin to see and feel things as if you are in dream, though in the physical world. And that's when you are opening to realities of the immediate domain above the gross physical, the subtle physical, the lower vital, and the lower mental domains, and things happening on that world, things which your mind can impose as images and shapes in that world, and you cannot distinguish anymore between that and the gross physical. This condition is what we call madness. Proper food, proper sleep brings you back, grounds you again in the gross physical, and as if those gates of perception shut down and you are back in the normal reality, as we call it. But you see, the problem was not of the physical. The physical could go on without sleep for a long time. Yes, it gets tired. It can go without food for a long time. Yes, it gets unbalanced. But what got unbalanced really in terms of behavior was this layer. Not even the mind proper, because while you're seeing this, the mind is wondering, my God, what am I seeing? That's the mind proper. But the thing which is getting carried away in the seeing, or which can't prevent the seeing, is part of the mind bound to the subtle physical. And that's the layer which has got destabilized, or rather disconnected from the gross physical. The same thing happens, this disconnection happens partially when the body is pushed to limits and the subtle physical needs to kick in and impose its control or its powers. When you are fasting, it's a common experience that the first day or two you feel tired, you feel low, and then the third day or fourth day, there's a new rush of energy which comes in, and you feel better than ever before, and you wonder why you were eating. Except that if you continue long enough, the physical body begins to deteriorate. But the thing which brought in that rush of energy was really an infusion from the vital, because the subtle physical disconnected from the gross physical to tap into the vital energy directly. And you, in your identity, are no more bound in the gross physical. You have become more identified with the subtle physical, and through it experience something of the energetic quality of the vital body. But the subtle physical can hold that energetic quality. It still feels like it's your gross physical, but because it has the same density, but it's not the most material part. In a sense, at that point, you're living more in the subtle physical than in the gross physical. But it's a state of imbalance. And that's why Sri Aurobindo and the mother discourage such conditions. Although in those states, one also feels as if one can tap higher qualities of energies, or even one can open as if to spiritual experiences more easily. Though generally what one is opening to are in the higher vital and higher mental, and they are not really spiritual experiences. They have a character of that because of their sense of opening and grandeur and vastness and intensities and so on. But these are conditions of instability, and they are a poor base to hold the real spiritual force. To be able to hold those, you need a base of stability, whereas this is a shaky condition. So it is discouraged in this yoga generally. But we can understand why certain traditions use such methods to, as if, tap into experiences of the subliminal and so on. Another example I give is what happens when you go on a trek for a long time. A similar thing happens. Although you're eating well, the sheer exhaustion of the physical brings it to a certain limit where the vital and the subtle physical kick in. And suddenly you have this burst of energy. Your body feels more springy. It feels more light. It feels more subtle. And all of those experiences are a shift out of the gross physical into the subtle physical. And you can, as if now, walk for a long time, climb for a long time. Your body feels so much lighter. In this condition, though, as long as we are not denying ourselves sufficient rest and nutrition, it can even be used as a way of training the gross physical to grow out of its limitations. But one has to do the necessary follow-up then to bring in these new values of the subtle physical into the normal domain of the physical activities. Of course, if one is not giving the body enough strength, enough rest and nutrition, then a similar unhealthy disconnection can also take place. But these are some examples which allow us to understand better what he's saying here. Not only the muscular strength and the solid strength of the limbs and physical stamina, but the finer, alert and plastic and adaptable force which our nervous and subtle physical parts can put into the activity of the frame, and the gross body is just the frame at that point. And you see these words now: finer, alert, plastic, adaptable. In those conditions where we are disconnected more in the subtle physical, you can understand how they work. In that state, you are much more alert to things. You recognize also the sensory inputs. Colors appear brighter. You see richer details in the scenery you're looking at, and so on. All of those are natural to the subtle physical. Yeah. Mhm. Yes. 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 Mhm. Mm. Yes. 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 Right. This reminds me of a point which I wanted to bring up earlier, when in relation to this discussion between the gross physical and the subtle physical. I was saying that there is a nutritional base that the physical body needs, I was saying, and there is also nutritional support that the subtle physical needs and the mind needs. And this is something I want to elaborate on because it all ties into this part of the discussion. I said the first requirement for the subtle physical body's health was proper sleep and proper food. And that's when we kind of digressed into the what happens when this is not given. But when the proper sleep and proper food is given, the necessity, as I said, was not so much for the most gross physical, but much more for this nervous and subtle physical, and through it affecting the mind and vital. At this point, we have to understand how this happens. The gross physical is made up of the arrangement of the tissues, which you are getting through the food anyway. But the thing which controls the arrangement of the tissues is more a organizing principle of life and mind in the gross physical. That part needs a refined material through which to work. If life force has to connect to the gross physical, it needs substance which is responsive to life impulse. If mind has to connect to the gross physical through life or otherwise or directly, it needs substance which responds to mental influence. And this is where the nutritional influence becomes critical. There is the gross layer of nutrition, and then there are layers which are more and more subtle. And as you go up the ladder of subtlety in nutrition, you give the physical body the base on which these higher levels of consciousness can begin to act upon the gross physical. Now, I'll give one example here. There are things which the body needs, we say, in very fine dosages. There is a particular balance, for example, of gold, of silver, of zinc, of copper, which the body requires. Selenium, all of these are poisonous if they are in large quantity. But if they are not there at all, then the body becomes sick. And you will see most of these are used in very fine, minute, trace level quantities in the nervous system and brain. And that's the sign. They are actually materials which are used to bridge the subtle physical and nervous layers with the gross physical. If they are missing, the gross physical tissue is not affected, but the process of the body's healing is affected. The body somehow cannot repair itself properly, or in its repair, it leaves out gaps, and certain processes are not working so well, or the nervous system is not able to communicate, and so on. And you see, they belong to the layer of life force and mind in the physical. And that's the layer which connects to life force in the vital and mind in the mental bodies. That's the layer in the gross physical plugging into those bodies, or from where those bodies plug into the gross physical. And the real requirement for the force and health and strength of the nervous and subtle physical parts is for proper nutrition to be given for these layers. Now, in the range of physical foods, there are foods which provide nutrition for the gross physical, and they are generally, and I'm making a very general statement here, they're generally associated with ground level foods and below ground level. So vegetables which grow underground are dense and packed in those things which assist the gross tissue. As you go up the chain and up in height, you find refinement organized. For example, the things which are more the leaves and greens, they come in between and touch the life energy in the gross physical. And then there are things which are the outcome, a rare outcome, consolidated, refined produce of plants, such as fruits, which relate to the highest gradation of mind qualities in the physical tissue. Now, I'm making this as a very general statement. In fact, everything has everything in it. The difference is only of the emphasis. Even in the vegetables, you have trace elements for the other layers. Even in the fruits, you have elements for the lower layers. The emphasis is different. And in the emphasis, we come one more step. In the fruit also and in the vegetable also, there is a subtle physical substance. In the emphasis in the fruit, you have the more refined subtle physical substance, whereas in the vegetable, you have the more gross subtle physical substance. So when you are eating those foods, you are actually nourishing all those layers equally. Now, this is a domain of exploration which physical science has not yet directly tapped. They have measured, but they have not understood. For example, we are able to measure the difference between inorganic vitamins and organic vitamins. We see the difference in the way the body responds to them. We see the difference in their crystalline structures, but at their molecular level, they appear to us to be the same. Because the molecular level is only the gross physical which we are seeing through the microscope. It is the subtle physical which decides the crystalline structure, and that's why the crystalline structure is seen to be different. And that crystalline structure we find is responsive to our energies and our thought intentions. And those are the things which we measure when, for example, the water crystal changes because of prayer or because of ill will and so on. And so it is also with the vitamin structures. They change, they are responsive to those layers because of their subtle physical component to which the microscope seeing, to which are invisible to the microscope seeing. So here, even in the fruit, we recognize there are all these layers, and the proper nutrition takes in all these layers at the same time, and the body's digestive process actually draws nutrition on all these layers. And that's why I said the first requirement for proper health and strength of the subtle physical and nervous parts is sleep and proper nutrition. So by proper nutrition here we include these gradations of the diet, the refined layers of fruits and so on. You will also notice that when people go into these kinds of retreats, meditative retreats and fasting or special diet retreats, the shift of emphasis to fruits and such foods is one of the reasons why we find ourselves becoming more in that subtle physical awareness than in the gross physical. Uh, Obviously, in the normal cycle of our life, the right balance of all these is important. So it's a very important question. If we live on fruits alone, is it harmful for the gross physical? As I said, every material, including the fruits, has the full range in any case, because the fruit has the physical tissue, and that does provide for those layers also. But in terms of its emphasis of energy, its emphasis is more in the subtler layers of the physical. And if you continue to eat only fruits, you will find after a while there will be a great clarity of mental energies, of life energies, and so on. But at some point, you will feel the gross physical feels light, but does not have the capacity to persist in physical energetic work. It will wear out easily if you do hard physical labor, for example. And you will get tired more easily, or the tissue will be lost more easily. If your work is not hard physical, you may not notice this difference, and you will just feel good and light. But still, eventually, over time, it does make a difference. I'll give my own experience, which was in eating raw foods for almost 10 years. And it was a very strict regimen which I followed. I was a bit obsessive with what I believed to be right. And it didn't even take sugar or salt. It had certain tremendous advantages for those higher layers, the mind, the life energies. Even the physical had a certain lightness, and I may even use these words, a finer, alert, and plastic feel. But the stamina of the gross physical activity was not so great. Mental stamina was great, but the physical stamina was not so great, and other difficulties of this kind. And it was only when I shifted to a mixed diet with the regular kind of cooked food and all that, that those things returned. So it was a great learning experience, and so that's why I will not advise an exclusive raw diet. It tends to deplete on some level in the gross physical. But a right balance, and that the balance is the principle we have to follow in this yoga. But according to one's temperament, one may find a particular mix more helpful for the body. The principle to follow is what will give you the best balance of health for all these layers. There is no point using food as a means of artificially pushing your consciousness into some layer or other. It does not help the transformation of the consciousness anyway. It just keeps you artificially in one state. The rest of it remains imbalanced and unchanged in any case. So as far as the goal of the integral yoga is concerned, do what helps to give an overall health base, and then work through the other means to develop the consciousness on all these levels and awaken it on all these levels. Then it's fine. And you have the same benefit as you would from the food diet, but now through a psychological process, but without the instability of the diet effort. So I said the first requirement was for the health and strength was this sleep and food. I'll just come to your question. I mentioned also, I did not elaborate on sleep. In sleep, similarly, a process takes place where something of the subtle body partially separates from the gross physical. Partially. It's not that the whole subtle body goes and wanders. If that happens, the body would go into deep and cataleptic trance almost. But a part of the mental consciousness may as if project itself away. But the bulk of the subtle body is still attached and close to the gross physical in the normal state of sleep. But at that time, the disengaging, the separation, allows this subtle physical to draw material on its level, allows the mental and vital layers to draw material on their levels. Because now they are no more bound to the limitation and the inertia of the gross physical. And that's the real rest, the real benefit of the sleep. As I said earlier, the gross physical can go without sleep for a very long time. It is those layers which need it much more. And if those layers are tensed, or if the gross physical is tensed and does not permit the subtle body to separate sufficiently, that's when you have the restless sleep in which you wake up tired. And the mind is tired, not so much the body. The life energy is depleted, not so much the body's capacity. You can still drive the body, but the body wears out more easily. So the sleep again becomes critical, and in quality of sleep, just as with food, if one recognizes that it is these higher levels which need to be, so to say, freed to rest and do their harmonization and reorganization, then we can make sure we enter sleep in the right way. The key to sleep training is the state in which you enter sleep. Everything that follows is the result of that entry point. If you enter into sleep tired, exhausted, nervous, tense, then your whole sleep is of that quality. That's the domain you tend to wander, even in dream and so on, and you wake up in that state. So you must consciously shut down, so to say, the mind, the life energies, and the gross physical. Mother describes the process for the physical to relax it, making it limp like a rag. And if you actually do that part by part, it assists the separation of the subtle body and allows the physical to do its own reorganization of health. Mother makes this other interesting comment. She says, sleep is the time when the gross body recuperates most easily because the mind no more bothers it. Instinctively, it knows what it must do to regain its natural balance. And when the mental body and generally the subtle body separates, it allows the gross body to do its thing and set itself right. And then, of course, the mind comes back and imposes its disharmonies again. But if we can take care to consciously, so to say, slow down, wind down, relax, and even I'll use the word shut down, the mind, vital and physical movements, agitations, energies, etc. And then slide into sleep with ourselves centered in our aspiration. And if possible, even infusing that aspiration in all these three layers, then it is as if the sadhana continues in the sleep state, because the aspiration permeates these layers and brings into them the very necessary responsive condition for a higher spiritual influence to act. I leave this as an indication. Just as with food, one can become conscious of those subtler gradations, so in sleep we can become conscious of the subtler gradations of the rest. This being the first requirement, as I said, for developing the health and strength of the nervous and subtle physical parts, the next thing could be other means, which then would come closer to the sports and physical exercises. And these could include things like asanas and pranayam. So Asanas, for example, can be done as a purely physical exercise for the gross physical. At the end of doing so many asanas for so long, well, my muscles have become more supple, my joints have become stronger, etc., etc. My form has become more slim, elegant, etc. But if the same asanas were done with awareness of the subtle physical, then I can bring into the subtle physical the imprint of something which strengthens it. If the same thing is done with full participation of the life force and mind, then even on those levels I can bring in all those things. So let's just take one example. You can stretch just as an exercise of stretch. Your mind is wandering, your heart is doing whatever its disturbed condition is doing, and you have had the physical result. But if before I start the asanas, I bring my mind turning it to the body, I bring my life energies and turn it to the body. And then I, who's the I doing all this? I center myself in my center of aspiration, become aware of that aspiration, base myself there, and from there now turn to become aware of the physical, vital, mental. And then infuse that aspiration into these three layers, even as I work to stretch the gross physical. At that point, if I'm aware of the other layers, then my stretch is not just of the gross physical, that's all somebody from outside sees, but I feel and I'm aware of the subtle body or the subtle physical at least, and include that in the extension. It's no more a stretch now, but it's rather an extension of awareness concentrated in which my aspiration infuses itself and my whole arm is offered or held in a prayerful state in that aspiration. In my awareness, I can feel the subtle, the gross physical tissue, the subtle body, or the subtle physical at least, or whatever I can feel of. It's a blur at first, but whatever you feel, and all that is included in a single awareness, turning in aspiration and awareness. You do this part by part on the body, and the body itself participates in the meditation. Otherwise, a normal, regular kind of meditation is a meditation in the mental consciousness, most. At best, something of the devotional element, which is also a large part in the mental body, that is doing. All the rest is quiescent, at best receives by reflection the benefits of the meditation, which is great, it is wonderful by itself. But here is a very different experience. It's a meditation primarily of the body and the rest following and supporting and participating in it. But it also changes the relationship of the body with these other layers. It begins to know them. They begin to know it, or rather, all of these unite in the common aspiration. At this point, although we are conscious of the gross physical, the actual imprint that we are conscious of is only the most semi-conscious part of the gross physical. There are layers below which are semi-conscious, subconscious, unconscious, and even inconscient. We are not conscious of them, but this layer which we are conscious of, participating, receiving, and whatever is happening there, is deeply connected with those layers, and automatically the benefit this uppermost layer of the gross physical receives, it seeps in into all those other layers. This thing persisted over time. The result goes down all the way into the most dense, inconscient parts. Sri Aurobindo points to the bones and the teeth in the body as the most representing the inconscient layers. And you will recall an incident I have narrated from the life of Bones Tukaram, famous bhakti saint a few centuries ago, that after his body was cremated, the story goes, when they picked the bones, they could hear the name of God being chanted in the bones. Now, whether it was a physical vibration felt or a subtle physical hearing is irrelevant. The point being that in the most inconscient part of the body, that same chanting, and he was a bhakti saint, he used to chant himself, chant the name of God and lose himself in immersion in that. That immersion had seeped in down to the most material part, and this is possible. And it makes possible in the most material part of the physical the reception also, therefore, of the divine influence and even the divine will. And then you can see, you can understand how all the rest which must be done on the physical body becomes so much easier or even automatic. So here we see an example of how in a simple exercise like asanas, one can bring in these higher, subtler dimensions of awareness and even awaken in it a spiritual meditative experience. Praying from the body, praying in the body, praying with the body, all of these can come in that domain of experience of asanas. Externally, you'll be seen to be doing the same thing. Internally, it's a whole different experience. The same with pranayam, and we had a discussion, a few examples of that earlier recently, where I said even in the pranayam, instead of merely taking life force, first of all, the lowest level is merely taking air, oxygen, in the gross physical. A layer above would be the taking in of life energy, which rides in and through the air. But a higher layer would be opening to the universal flow of life energy, and then opening to the energy in its higher level, not life energy, but spiritual energy. And often at that point, the experience is as if feeling it above rather than around. But even if it's above, it pours through the around. Nevertheless, its origin is felt above. And then further experiences can develop where, for example, one is identified with the vastness, the body being inside it, and then the balance of breathing changes. When I am identified with the body, I breathe in from outside. But when I am identified with the whole, or if I am identified with the vastness, I breathe into the body. The incoming breath of the body is my pouring into the body. And when the body breathes out, it's me returning to my wideness. And it's a very different experience. Or even another variation of it is when the body and the wideness are felt as a continuity, and the breathing is just the energy or awareness moving between two different parts of myself, my larger part and my smaller part, or my base, vast base, and my frontal projection. And it's just a flowing between these two parts within me. These are all variations of experience which belong to the domain of what is superficially seen as the pranayam exercise. But on a consciousness level, so many other dimensions can open up. In all these, and I just leave this as a reference, you will see the primary action is on these subtler parts, and the secondary action is more on the gross physical. In the actual training of Hatha Yoga, asanas and pranayama are in fact used as the entry point to open to such domains of experience. But the actual release into these experiences is done by awakening the Kundalini. That's the process of Hatha Yoga. Sri Aurobindo says in this yoga, we don't do it that way. We do it by the direct opening of consciousness to the larger and higher reality, and that descending will liberate the Kundalini as needed. But we have got to a higher experience first without waiting for the awakening of Kundalini. Rather, it's the higher experience which completes the opening of the Kundalini and such things. So it's a more direct method, it's more rapid, more safe, more complete in its results. But I point to these two as an example of how one can bring into the nervous and subtle physical parts that kind of a training or strengthening and intensifying or increasing of health. One may just as well do it without such specific exercises. Once you catch the principle of asana and pranayam, You can be imposing the same exercise, so to say, while just sitting on your chair, while just walking on the road, or while in the midst of any activity in principle. Of course, it requires a certain focusing of concentration, attention, which may not be easy at first. But at least while walking or sitting, one could still do the same thing. Instead of doing one limb at a time, as in the asana, I may use the asana as a point of special concentration on the limbs, but I may continue the asana state on the whole body as an asana while I sit on the chair or while I walk. And in fact, this is intended in the whole science of asanas in Hatha Yoga. The very word asana is seated posture. It's not a position that you take. It's the natural state in which the whole body is. It's not one hand extended or one leg, but the whole body with that emphasis. And they say the perfection of the asana is when you can be in that posture as comfortably as you are seated on your chair or on the cross-legged on the ground. When it becomes as natural, then it is perfected. And at that point, your body can be in any of these positions. The position is irrelevant. It is the state of awareness that has been awakened. So I leave these as indications, but the result of these is what I will point to now. When the nervous and subtle physical become finer, alert, plastic, and adaptable, one can actually feel or even see with clairvoyant sight in the subtle physical or the rest of the subtle body. It's as if the fibers are finer and more tightly woven and meshed. One can feel or see that. And that's an actual objective measure of the health and strength of those layers, subtle body. For example, it is one of the tests which clairvoyant yogis would do to assess the readiness of somebody for their path. If they had the capacity, they would see the subtle physical, the aura of the subtle body, and see what were the weaknesses, what were the limitations, and first work to heal and bridge those limitations. Then only take them into the path, especially for more difficult paths like Kundalini yoga or things which involved occult practices and things like that. They would see these things and from there decide the readiness or competence of the person for those types of paths. Even now in certain domains of occult practices, if there is not this very fine fiber of strength of base in the subtle body, a person is told not to take up those practices because there are holes, there are gaps through which there can be harm or through which instabilities could develop. Rather, they are taught to build and strengthen these layers before moving on to those kinds of practices. But this is, of course, only true of people with a deeper spiritual insight. The conventional occult schools, they just teach you techniques without consideration of competence or even dangers involved. So this is an actual objective measure one can see and feel in the texture of the subtle physical and subtle when it becomes healthy and strong. Sri Aurobindo used to take these into consideration, and the mother also, when they assessed a person for this path. Not so much for the path, but for the work to be done on the person. And you will recall a passage I had read, this would have been almost a year ago. One of the early sadhaks who had come, Sri Aurobindo looked at him and then said, "Your nerves are weak, you must strengthen them." Now this is something he's seeing. The nerves weak is not looking inside the physical, he's looking at the subtle physical with the clairvoyant sight. And then he told the person, "My nerves also were weak. I made them strong by yoga. And what's the method? He said, you must bring peace into the nerves. And so we come now to the third activity, third means. I said first was sleep and proper nutrition. The second I said were processes such as asanas, pranayam, but done with this deeper perception. But the third is the direct method, which is the means used in this yoga. Consciously open the consciousness to the divine. Invoke by aspiration the settling of the mother's force, the mother's peace, the mother's wideness, mother's light. These are like a foundation. Of all these things, Sri Aurobindo says peace is the most solid foundation. As one brings peace into the physical, in the subtle physical, in the life energies, in the mental, whatever, in all of these, they automatically acquire the solidity and stability which the peace brings. And the peace infusing in them develops and establishes that base of solidity and stability. The health and strength follow automatically. When Dyuman Bhai, he was one of those with titanic energy and able to do actually work on a titanic scale. When Dyuman Bhai used to get exhausted, and that means a lot, it was work done through day, going late into the night, starting early in the morning, very little sleep, food was not too important, and exhausting work. When he would get tired, and that was really, for a normal person, it would be way beyond his capacity. When he would get tired, needing rest, mother taught him this method, and he shared this with us. The mother said, you lie down flat on your back, relax your body, and then from in your physical consciousness, you open to her light and her force, invoking her light and her force to settle into in the whole being. Obviously, she is speaking of relaxing the body, but we can see how it will apply to all those other layers also. Opening the whole being to her light and force. And then she said, you must allow that light and force to penetrate all the way down into the very cells of the body. So going through all these layers down to the most material, up to the cells. And then soak in that, hold that. And she said, if you do this even for 10 or 15 minutes, you will be completely recharged and refreshed. And he said this is what he began to do after that. And that's how he could continue to do this kind of work. The name of the person? Dyuman Bhai. Yes. Yes, yes, the same person. Yes. Yes. So this is the method she spoke of. And you can see the point, the principle behind it is really this opening to her light, her peace, her force, and these are the foundations. We do that, and the health and strength of the nervous and subtle physical parts would automatically grow. This is the direct method. Of course, into that, the will of the mind, the intention with which we do, and of this he will now discuss. There is also the still more dynamic force which a call upon the life energies can bring into the body and stir it to greater activities, even feats of the most extraordinary character, of which in its normal state it would not be capable. And then there is also the strength which the mind and will, by their demands and stimulus and by their secret powers, can impart to the body or impose upon it as masters and inspirers. So we have now so many layers. First, the health and strength of the gross physical, and then we have the health and strength of the nervous and subtle physical, and then we have the life energies, and then we have the mind and will. And each of these must be made strong, and their influence upon the body must be similarly clarified. So we look at now the life energies, still more dynamic force. So whatever the subtle physical and nervous can bring is nothing compared to what the life dynamic force of life energies can bring. And stir it to greater activities, even feats of the most extraordinary character, of which in its normal state it would not be capable. So the body has a normal state, and then there is this abnormal state where the life force pours in and brings into it something, a greater activity, feats of the most extraordinary character. They are an abnormal state for the body normally. What he says is eventually the perfection of the body includes making these a normal state, what we call abnormal otherwise. But this is the distinction brought in by life force. And life force brings in huge energy, universal life energy, and all the characteristics of life energy which are not there in the physical, overtly at least. Again, in its actual action, it may act through the subtle physical and the nervous, and then upon the physical. And that passage should be capable of taking the intensity. That's why he's going in this sequence from the physical, subtle physical, and then life energy. If you develop life energy first without the strong base of subtle physical or sufficient health in the gross physical, you would have these abnormal states, but they would leave the body shattered. And it would not be able to survive even that kind of a manifestation. That's why the first base here being built, then it can take in all that extra. So when the life energy increases enormously, okay, first of all, the person can do work immensely. But actually on a physical level, one can do things the body couldn't do. And I'll give one example which I have seen. This is somebody in our school as a student who had instinctively this opening to life energy. In those days, we didn't have these terms, we didn't know these things in this way. But he had it instinctively, probably a carryover from a past life. He could do dips, the whole body resting on the arms and then doing this movement, taking the weight of the body in dips. Where at that age, we could normally do something like 30. The best in the group could do 40 or 50. And then after a point, you can't move. The body actually, the muscles pain as they move. And at some point, you can cross the pain threshold and the muscles just refuse to move. You're just locked. You can't even will them into movement and they can't move. One can reach that point. Some of these people could take it to that level. My body was differently made. I was not so strong, and I could never take it to that point. After the pain threshold, I refused to go. Those people who had the greater vitality and stronger physique would cross the pain threshold to the point where the muscles stop moving. This person, as a challenge, would push and without slowing down, keep on doing the push-ups, crossing 50, crossing 100, 200, 300. And at some point, he said, I can go on. In fact, the more I do, the easier it becomes. But you could see you could feel that even his muscular fibers were tearing beyond a point. And afterwards, a few days later, there would be this huge pain and the healing of the body and so on. This is done by the infusion of life energy into the physical. And for that period at least, it's as if the physical capacity of the body has been pushed to a new level. And that's what he says, feats of the most extraordinary character, of which in its normal state it would not be capable. Another example would be, again, we are blurring between the vital and the subtle physical, but still, would be when the body needs calories in cold. And we have spoken of the example of the sumo training, which is part of the which is part of the Tibetan training for certain lamas. And it's a part of the system of training that they have. By itself, it has no spiritual value. but it has a great practical value. The training involves certain breathing exercises and visualizations intended to awaken the center of life force in the region of the stomach chakra. And through that, a huge infusion of life energy can be brought, by which the body can heat up to whatever extent, never feel cold. Now, having perfected that skill, the test is done thus. On a winter evening, the lama is taken to the edge of a lake which is frozen. A hole is cut in the ice, and they dip a blanket into the freezing water. He sits there on the lake edge, bare bodied, completely bare, and this freezing water soaked blanket is wrapped around him. And with body heat, he must dry the blanket. By the time he has dried it, the next blanket is soaked and placed on him. And again, the blankets are recycled. Again and again, they're soaked in the freezing water. And from the evening through the night, when it becomes coldest, he must continue until morning. And if at the morning he is still fine and he is able to dry the blankets, he has passed the test. Now he has perfected this capacity. I've seen videos of such monks which appeared in some National Geographic or Discovery Channel. And they showed these monks on a journey through the snow. And it's night, so they lie down in the snow bare-bodied. They go to sleep through the night on bare-bodied on the snow. And then the video showed them getting up the next morning. They're fine and fresh, again bare-bodied, and continue walking on the snow. Sometimes they use slippers. Not so much for the cold, because the slippers don't protect you from the cold. They just protect you from stones. And they're still walking on the on the snow, bare-bodied. And they walk for days together. The food is the only thing that they're carrying. That's the only food they have. How much food can you carry for a 10-day journey? You can imagine how little they must be eating. Now, obviously, there is nowhere in the body that much of calories. At the end of the journey, they have not lost weight as we would have if we had been burning up all our calories and eating so little food. But it is the perfection of this skill of the tsumo fire, basically an opening to life energy in the physical. And from there, the body's capacity is now taken to this extraordinary degree. I'll give one more example which involves mastery of life force connecting with the physical consciousness. But I'm not sure here how much it is purely life force and how much is the subtle physical involved. But this is another demonstration which was done by a Tibetan martial artist. He placed between 3 drums, sheets of paper on a frame. He stood on the first drum, and in between were the sheets of paper on the frame. He concentrated for a while, and with a gesture of taking up his energy. Now, it's as if he is pulling up his life force, and with it pulling up the physical body. And at that point, it's as if the gross body has become lighter. And he walks on the paper sheet across the third drum, stops there, and then again breathes and draws down the life force back to his normal state. And then, of course, the television commentator tries to step and he falls straight through. But this is also a potential of the physical body in response to an imposition of a higher energy. But again, I'm not too sure how much of this is the vital energy alone and how much involves the subtle physical. But nevertheless, it involves a manipulation of life energies, taking up the physical and even changing its weight, so to say. Mother had an interesting comment to make. When she chose her personal attendant, she had at various times a few people, The last person that she chose was a person who was at that time in her late teens. And she went through her own process of selection, and obviously there was a relationship from earlier lives where she had worked in similar capacity. But then when she was formally taken in the work, Mother met her personally and she said, "If I fall, will you be able to lift me?" And before the attendant could answer, Mother smiled mischievously and said, "I can make myself light as a feather or heavy as a stone." That was all. Fortunately, such a situation never occurred. But that comment was suggestive, and it showed the perfection of the physical consciousness. It was not done by occult means. It was done as a direct liberation of the potential in the physical consciousness, which is what Sri Aurobindo refers to also in the synthesis of yoga. When he speaks of Utthapana, the term used as a siddhi and the 8 siddhis, these siddhis are currently in the yogic tradition seen as abnormal occult powers. And yes, they can be acquired by occult means. But the way Sri Aurobindo presents them as part of the framework of the yoga of self-perfection and the integral yoga, they are not seen as abnormal powers of a higher domain overriding a lower, which is what we saw in the example of the person walking on paper. Rather, it is a potential in the physical consciousness which is to be liberated by action of the higher spiritual force. And we may say the potential is seated in the subtle or the subtle physical, but it is eventually to be established in the gross physical as its true potential. And it is that which Sri Aurobindo was working upon in his own consciousness, even in his early years, even before the ashram was established. In the 1910 onwards, he was already working on this domain. By 1914, as I have said before, he had reached the supramental consciousness, but the work on the physical was going on, and its transformation and liberation. So we had an interesting interview with a person who was the mother's driver. As a young boy, he grew up in contact with the mother in those days, although his family used to live in Pondicherry and there was some insulation from the general population and the ashram. Pardon? No, not Pavitra. This was a young boy who grew up. His name was Bala. He was mother's driver for a while, and then at some point he had a rebellion in teenage. He left, and many things happened, and then he came back, and of course, mother always forgave. But he came in touch with Sri Aurobindo and the mother at a young age, including the period, I believe, just before Sri Aurobindo retired from public contact. So he had even apparently sat on his lap or things like that. Now, the reason this happened was because his mother was working as a maid in Sri Aurobindo's room in the ashram of that time. And as part of that work, she was there when Sri Aurobindo was alone, sweeping the floor or cleaning. And subsequently, she used to tell, oh, this boy was grandson of that lady. She used to tell the grandchildren, "Oh, Sri Aurobindo, he's a great magician. I'm very afraid of him." So they would ask why, and she narrated certain incidents. She said, "I don't know what was happening. I was in his room, and I would see him with his hands like that for hours together, and his leg up in the air, and sometimes both hands and legs. I don't know what he was doing. He was doing some great magic." And then she said, "Sometimes I would look, and he would not be there in the room. He'll have vanished. And then I'm doing my work, and I find, oh, he's back in his chair, and I don't know how he did it. He was a great magician." And that was all she could take of it. But it's an interesting observation, because that's the time when Sri Aurobindo in his record of yoga is noting how he's going through these experiences and perfecting Utthapana, levitation as it is popularly understood. But Utthapana itself has several degrees. And one of the degrees is simply the release from fatigue. The arm can be held up indefinitely, hours together, and it never experiences fatigue. or even the whole body can be up and in activity and never experience fatigue. That would be the perfection of some of the things we're describing here on a preliminary level. But that perfection is achieved only when the supramental consciousness begins to work on the physical. Then there can be the perfection. Otherwise, there can be a basic liberation, though not a perfection. And then Sri Aurobindo has notes in the record of yoga where he discusses how this uttapana has become now stabilized, or some parts, certain aspects of it are still unstable. In its extreme, it is not just fatigue, it is even complete freedom from all physical inertia, including gravitation. Gravitation is seen in this context only as a process of inertia. If you free up the inertia, you are free also of gravitation. Now you can see this purely as a psychological description, but it is also true as a purely physical description. If you can free an object from inertia, it is also free of the law of gravity. This is pure physics also, but also it is true on a psychological level. In fact, the technologies which are used by certain extraterrestrial spaceships, when they can move rapidly and move in zigzag, reveals immediately that they have learned the means to overcome inertia. So they can accelerate instantly and move in strange zigzag patterns without destroying themselves. But automatically from there comes the liberation from gravitation. Anyway, this is a different domain. The point being that Sri Aurobindo had perfected these things at a very early stage. And all the subsequent work was taking it way beyond, and those domains which he says even the human mind would not understand. So I have digressed again, but this came from the example of how one can actually overcome limitations of the physical by the action, direct action of life force. And then beyond that, he says and then beyond that, there is also the strength which the mind and will, by their demands and stimulus, and by their secret powers, which we use or by which we are used without knowing clearly the source of their action, can impart to the body or impose upon it as masters and inspirers. So life force subtle physical could do a lot, life force could do a lot, but mind, he says, is master and inspirer. And it can also infuse strength from mind and will. It can also infuse strength on the body by their demand and their stimulus and their secret powers. Now these secret powers, he says, sometimes we use or sometimes we are used by those secret powers without knowing clearly the source of their action. And yet they bring that strength into the physical body. So we are discussing now something extraordinary here. Each of these layers can bring its own strength and health onto the physical consciousness. And the perfection of all of these would be the perfection of strength and health of our being. And in each implied also is the relationship of that layer with the physical consciousness to be opened up sufficiently that it can bring its action on the physical. And of course, it implies also that each of these layers has been sufficiently perfected. Otherwise, it can't offer its perfection to the gross physical. The point being, the perfection of the gross physical includes all these layers participating in that perfection. And obviously, therefore, the passage between the physical and these layers, as well as the perfection of those layers, is implied. This is why you will see in the synthesis of yoga, Sri Aurobindo keeps the physical transformation for later, and rather focuses on the awakening to the supramental consciousness first, and by its aid taking up the transformation of the physical. Of course, one would work to develop the physical consciousness, nevertheless, to make it ready, but nevertheless to transform it would require this higher power, by which it can be done far more rapidly, far more easily, and more completely. So this last part is a bit of a mystery. We can understand the mind and will by their demands and stimulus can do a lot to the physical. And you have experienced this. Even the example I have mentioned earlier of the person doing his push-ups, taking it to this extraordinary number, the thing which is driving even the life force is the mental will. And in fact, in most training of sports, the key of the training is always the mental will. Whether it is gymnastics, whether it's athletics, whether it is strength, whether it is suppleness, whether it is sheer sustaining power when you're running, it's always the will which has to be trained. And the problem with this training is one can see the body could have gone on, but the one who gave up was the mental will. I gave my own example. I said, I could not cross that threshold where the muscles pained. Who decided that I give up? Not the muscles themselves. My mind flagged. My mind said, I can't push my body beyond this. I am tired. And it gave up. And the difference between such a person and the real athlete is the athlete persists. And his will has been taken up to that point where whatever the resistance, whatever the pain, without limit, he goes on. I've seen also another example when we were, for example, swimming underwater. That was the point where I broke that barrier. I took that up as a challenge because I found that was one activity where it was not the body's incapacity. To hold the breath, and our pool was 33 meters, 33 and 1/3. It was not the holding the breath, because I can easily hold my breath, walk slowly across from one end of the pool to the other, and even move my hands as if I'm swimming and walk from one end to the other. I could still hold the breath and walk back. When you're underwater and when you're swimming, it's the something which makes you suffocated, afraid, and the body creates all these pressures and pains, and at some point the will breaks. And at that point, you come up and you gasp for air. And it was the one activity where I found the physical strain did not come in the way, and it was purely a point of mental will. And I, as if took that up as a challenge, and I found I could push it. And the whole struggle was between the mind and the body instinct. The body wants to gasp for air. The body is saying, I don't have enough air. It's uncomfortable. And the mind, no, relax, take it easy, push, continue, persist. And I got all the way through to the end of the pool and back. I think I hit 42 meters. I was in the top 10 of the ashram for a few years. 10th, of course. But it was all without any extraordinary physical strength. My muscles were not strong. My endurance was not strong. It was pure mental will. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Wow. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Right. 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 No. Okay. It's right. Right. Uh-huh. Yes. It's the same. Yeah. It's the same challenge when those examples we have of people swimming the English Channel and things like that. It's the mental will finally. Because at some point the body feels I can't do more. And it's the mind which then drives it beyond. And in a sense, you will see all physical training starts with the mental will pushing the physical to cross the limits a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and helping the body get used to crossing those limits until we say, oh, now my body is capable, now it's used to it, and so on. But the one who pushed it, broke those barriers, was still the mental will. And that, we've still not come to the secret power. So the mind, the strength which the mind and will by their demands and stimulus impose upon the body, can impart to the body and impose upon it as masters and inspires. And the relationship is of master. You are pushing the body. The body is refusing, but you're pushing it. It's the same thing when a person is in grave injury. I'll stop with this example for today. You see this as a dramatic situation in cinema, but it's also a real life situation. When a person has been badly injured and is sliding into unconsciousness, you will find it is critical for the doctors to ensure that the person remains conscious. And they will keep telling him to stay conscious. They'll try to connect to him, pull him out. And at that point, if you observe, if you've ever felt that point of transition of on the brink of blackout, you, the mental will, is as if being sucked into something, and you know if you cross that threshold, you'll black out. You will lose your self-awareness. But you are struggling with that border. What keeps you out? There's nothing else except the pure will intention, shifting the attention out from that black pitch which would swallow you in. It's a similar point when there were a few examples of people who did that underwater swim and with mental will pushed beyond a point and the body blacked out. And underwater they blacked out. But there's a point where you can feel the blackout is coming on you and you can will yourself to stay out of it. And that's pure mental will. And if you can stay out of it, you are sure to survive in the body's injury. If you allow yourself to slide in and become unconscious at that point in those extreme injuries, then there is greater risk that the body will also slide back. And the key insight which we are seeing here is the mental will choosing to survive can as if drag the whole body and get through that extreme damage. So this is the mental will as master and inspirer imposing on the body. We have not touched the secret powers of the mind, and maybe we'll take that up next time. We have already crossed our time limit for today. We don't have much time for questions, but if there's anything, we can just take it up quickly. Yes. See, the equivalent of the dynamic perception, the equivalent experience could occur in any part. It is effectively something of the intuitive consciousness bound in that layer which is coming forward momentarily. But here he is specifically referring to its action in the life energies. Because in fact, the life energy is the hub of all our instincts. Even in the physical consciousness, it is the life energy which is the driver of the instinct, as also in the mental consciousness. So the seat of this dynamic perceptions he places in the life energy. But something similar happens on all levels. Especially here, it is also the seat of all action. Physical or mental, anywhere the action is driven by life energy. So if there is an instinctive or intuitive perception in the action itself, its seat would be in the life force. Yeah.
Obviously, the healing process, for example, after accident, how can...
Yes. It's a very interesting question in the context of what we have studied. We have seen the physical body can be influenced by, of course, its own natural processes, and then the subtle physical, and then the life energies, and then the mind. In healing, all these three levels could be involved. And different types of medication operate on different levels. I'll just give a few examples quickly. The normal medicine of allopathy, conventional allopathic medicine, the bulk of them operate on the physical processes. They've been observed, this chemical affects that chemical in a chain, this is the reaction. You give this has this result. Homeopathy, on the contrary, takes that same physical thing but abstracts from it the subtle physical. So that nothing of the physical molecule is left, but the subtle physical vibration and the subtle physical substance is as if separated and amplified. And that's what is carried in the homeopathic medicine, and it acts on the subtle physical and through the subtle physical. And that's why, in certain sense, the potency increases as you dilute more, because it actually takes it up the chain into the subtle physical in its subtler levels. On the vital level, the action, the medication is more the emotional bonding and support of people. Now, a patient on a bed draws a lot of energy from those around. If you have loving energies of your family members and friends, it is a great help for the recovery. If you're all alone and you feel depleted with no support of energy, the body takes much longer. But it's actually a healing process when people come and help in this emotional support. Or if somebody does pranic healing, Reiki, etc., which involve direct infusion of life force. So that acts on the level of life force. And then similarly on the mental level, the will of the patient, the will of the doctor, the will of the people around, the ideas they project, the intention, expectation they have, and particularly the patient, all of these have an immediate impact on the healing. I've given an example earlier, which is a study that was done. During surgery, while the patient is unconscious under sedation, the doctor is asked to make comments. Comments like, oh, this patient will take a long time to heal. Oh, this is a very bad and difficult case. And opposite comments, oh, he'll recover very quickly, it's an easy one. Now, they found an exact correlation between such statements and the actual healing. Even when actually it was a trivial case, the doctor's statement that this will take a long time left a suggestion in the mind, in the subliminal, which worked on the physical healing process. So, on the mental level, your optimism, your conviction that you will be healed and you will get over it quickly, all of these have their effect. So, effectively, any medication involves all four levels or action on all four levels, and if you can synchronize them and align all these levels in a positive way, you have the most rapid and effective healing. Otherwise, you have to struggle between contrary influences, which is often the case. It's a very quick perspective, but you can see there's so much more one can explore there. So you see how this framework which Sri Aurobindo is offering is actually extremely comprehensive. In a few broad sketches, he is covering huge potential knowledge, experience, and practice, which would all work towards working in the physical consciousness and its transformation. We'll pause here and continue next Friday. Oh.